Let's look at some examples of scope in Python so that we can get a better understanding of how to access variables and functions from different areas of the code. So I have an example here. I have created a variable called myGlobalVar and I've initialized it to 10. I have a function called modifyGlobal, and then in that function, it is printing the value of myGlobalVar. And then below that, I am actually calling the function. Now, if I run this right now, it's going to output myGlobalVar in 10 just fine because the function has no problem accessing a variable that's in the global scope. Now, if I wanted to set this myGlobalVar to a different value inside the function, I'm going to move this print statement out here. And in my modifyGlobal, I'm going to put myGlobalVar equals 20. Now, when I run this, we're going to get that it's still outputting 10. Well, the reason that this is happening is because inside the function, when it initializes this variable at this value, it's going to create the variable and put it in this function's local scope. It doesn't care if there's already a variable in global scope with that same name. So in order to actually change myGlobalVar from within a function, we have to use the global keyword. And we use it by putting global and then the name of the variable that we want to treat as a global variable inside this function. So now if I run this, I'll get the output 20 because it's actually changing this variable here from inside the function. And to see what variables or functions might be in the global scope, we can call the globals built-in function. So if I call print and then I call the globals function, and because this returns a dictionary, I only want to see the keys. So I'm going to call the dictionary's keys method. And when I run this, we'll see here that modify global, which is the function name, is in the global scope, and myGlobalVar is in the global scope. But what's interesting is if I remove this one here, the one that was actually initialized in the global scope, and only leave the one that's in the function, when I run this again, we'll see that myGlobalVar is still in global scope because inside the function, when this created it, it created it in the global scope. So now let's look at an example that has local scope, enclosing scope, and global scope. I'm going to remove this code and put in some new code. You'll see that I have myGlobalVar initialized to 10. And then I have an outer function. And then inside this outer function, I have myLocalVar initialized to 25. And then I have two print function calls, which are going to print the values of myLocalVar and myGlobalVar because the outer function has access to its local variables and any variables that are in scopes that are outside of it. And then I have an inner function defined within the outer function with a myInnerVar initialized to 50. And it's going to print all three variables because it has access to its variables, which will be its local scope, and then the variables just outside of it and its enclosing scope, which will be myLocalVar, and the variables outside of that, which will be the global scope for myGlobalVar. And if I run that, we'll see that we get myLocalVar and GlobalVar for the outer function, and then we get myInnerVar, myLocalVar, and myGlobalVar from the inner function. And because these print functions here are built into the Python standard library, these are actually built-in scope. So this example here is using all four scopes. It's also good to know that any variables that are created inside loops or conditional statements are in the scope of whatever those loops or conditional statements are. So here I have this for loop and this if conditional that are in the global scope, and it's creating this loop var. And I'm going to go ahead and move this print statement down here. And then this if conditional, which is creating the if var. And when I run this, it's going to output the created in if conditional and created in the for loop just fine. There's no issues. Now, if I were to tab these out and put these in a function, so I could call it just define my funct, you'll see that I get an error here that says if var is not defined because these loops are being created inside the function. Outside the function, the Python interpreter has no idea what these names are. So the loop var and if var would now be in the local scope of my funct. Built-in scope would be your types such as string, range, float, int, tuple, and then functions that are built in like print or length or globals or locals. Any built-in function type or error would be in the built-in scope, and they are in the outermost scope, which is accessible to anywhere in the program. And the last thing we'll look at is how precedence works. So I have a car variable initialized to Chevy, and then I have an outer car function, and it is going to print the value of car, and then an inner car function that is going to print the value of car. When we get to the inner function, this value of car, the inner function is first going to look in its local scope. And because I have this code commented out, it's not going to find a car variable. So it's going to jump into its enclosing scope where, again, this line is commented out. So it's not going to find a car variable. So then it's going to jump out into the global scope and look for a car variable. And if one wasn't there, it would then look into the built-in scope to see if there was a built-in variable car. But since we have one in global scope, this is what it is going to find. The outer function is going to check its local scope where it will not find the car variable. So it's going to jump into its global scope and find it out here. So the first time I run this, the value of car is going to be Chevy in every case. Now, if I were to remove this comment so that the inner car function has a car variable, then this value here is going to be for this right here. But the outer function is still going to have to jump out into the global scope and get the value Chevy. So now when I run it, the outer car is still Chevy, the inner car is now Dodge, and the outside any function or class, which is the global scope, is still Chevy. And if I remove this comment, now the inner car is going to find the value Dodge, the outer car print function is going to find the value Ford, and then the global scope is still going to be Chevy. So when I run this, we get outer car Ford, inner car Dodge, and outside any function or class Chevy.
Now I'm going to show you how to use the variable that's in the outer function from within the inner function. But before I do this, I'm going to add the global keyword in here and put car there. So when I run this now, we'll see that I get outer car Ford, and then inner car and outside any function or class car is Dodge. Now, if I were to remove the car that is outside either the outer or inner function and run this again, I'll get the same output. Ford for outer car, and then inner car and outside any function or class car is Dodge. And this is because when we use the global keyword, if there is not already an existing variable in the global scope, it creates it in the global scope. And if there is one, then it simply modifies the one that is already in the global scope. So how do we work with the variable that is in the outer function? We do this by using the nonlocal keyword. And the nonlocal keyword works just like the global keyword, except for it goes into the enclosing function instead of going all the way into the global scope. And I'm going to copy this print function here for my outer car, and I'm going to put it down below my call to the inner function. So when I get to this point, it's still going to output that the car is equal to Ford. But after I call the inner car function, the non-local car is going to modify this variable to equal Dodge. So when I run this, now I get outer car Ford, inner car Dodge, outer car Dodge, because it's been changed with this function call here. And then outside any function or class is still Chevy. So now you should have a pretty good understanding of how scope works, and some of the key things to keep in mind about scope are accessing variables and functions, knowing when variables are going to go out of scope and be destroyed, and not causing naming conflicts by trying to create names that already exist in the scope that you are working in.